"Don't worry. The police will protect you." He smiled slyly like a street thug, his hand sliding under a girl's skirt, and then he laughed like it was just part of the job. A few minutes later, a kick came crashing into his face like a bolt from the sky, delivered by the one person who refused to look away. This was the moment a black female officer reminded another uniformed cop, a skirt is not a license for abuse, and silence is no longer an option. Think you know justice? Watch. See where it begins. Stay until the end to find out what made an entire police department turn on its own. Willow Reese grew up in a town where peeling white walls still held traces of old flags and older stairs. She didn't remember much about her mother, apart from a few laminated photos, a faint scent left on the cover of a faded children's book. Her mother passed when she was 3, and after that her father grew silent like a tree without a canopy. Willow learned to speak with silence, and over time she learned to choose friends by the way they looked at her, not the color of their skin. She met Zuri Hale at 6 on the first day of first grade. Zuri stood at the edge of the playground, uniform wrinkled, shoes too big, eyes fixed on a patch of dirt like she wished she could crawl into it. Willow approached for no reason other than the crooked bow in Zuri's hair that caught her eye. She offered half a sandwich and sat beside her without saying a word. Zuri took the sandwich and gave a small nod. That was how it started. Without promises, without conditions, just a quiet acceptance between two children who didn't yet understand why the world felt so cold. The whole town knew Zuri was the daughter of Staff Sergeant Hale, a Marine who died somewhere across the world, as news reports like to say without giving details. Zuri's mother was a night shift nurse, often gone, so Zuri practically grew up in Willow's kitchen. No one said it, but they knew that's where Zuri had dinner, did her homework, and sometimes fell asleep on the sofa with crumbs still on her cheek. The two often sat on the floor by the window, listening to rain drum on the metal roof, sharing old library books Willow brought home. The world outside wasn't as gentle. Kids at school called them mixed color, half joking, half serious, as if the friendship between a white girl and a black girl was a game that broke some hidden rule. Once a boy spat on the book Willow was reading to Zuri and said, "White pages aren't for black hands." Willow shoved him, got punished, and spent a week cleaning the girl's bathroom. Zuri stood outside the door the whole time, silent. When Willow came out, she pressed a napkin soaked in scented water into her friend's hand. They didn't apologize or comfort each other because they understood there were bigger things they had to carry alone. Willow loved books, quietly but absolutely. Within the pages, she found shelter from the slow-burning hatred behind lingering stares and filthy whispers. Zuri loved order, clear rules. She hated laws without teeth, words framed for walls but never enforced. At 16, Willow said she wanted to be a writer. Zuri said she'd become a cop. Willow looked at her, whispering, "Really?" And Zuri replied, "I'll be the one thing between them and people like you." That sentence, though spoken on a breeze-light afternoon, etched itself into Willow's memory like a beautiful curse. And then, not long after, Zuri did become a police officer. Willow remained the girl who walked home with books each afternoon, believing that if she stayed on the right path, everything would stay safe. But on that day, her footsteps led her to the place where the first lift of a skirt began, and not everyone would keep standing still to watch. Willow loved the feel of old book covers pressed to her chest as she carried them home, each cover holding a different story, a different world, a temporary escape from the silence her town tried to drown her in. She often turned down the narrow path behind the library, the bumpy brick road that had once been her and Zuri's childhood tunnel. One time, they found a dead sparrow lying on its side beneath a tree, and they sat staring at it like it was an omen. Adults would never explain. Now, the path remained, only Zuri no longer walked beside her. Zuri had become a cop. She didn't choose that path to make a statement, and certainly not out of faith in the uniform or the printed power of a badge. She chose it because one time, standing outside their school gates, she watched a black student get his face slammed into the sidewalk because he was suspected of stealing a phone. Back then, Zuri could do nothing but watch. Afterward, she made a vow: if the system could bend laws until they broke, someone had to be standing in the right place when the cracks began to show. Willow did not oppose that decision. She understood Zuri the way one understands those willing to walk into a storm, not because they believe themselves invincible, but because they know the storm will come whether they are there or not. Their friendship never needed many words to survive. Each chose a different path, yet both intersected at places no one else could see. That day, the sky was clear, the breeze gentle, and the sunlight cast whispering shadows on the gray-brown walls. Willow left the library near dusk. After borrowing 3 forgotten antique books from the last shelf, she considered taking the longer route but didn't because the path near the police station was shorter and she knew Zuri was stationed nearby. On her phone, she typed quickly, "Just dropped by the library. Heading back after your patrol." Zuri replied, with a magnifying glass emoji and a period. For Zuri, it was her subtle way of reminding Willow to stick to main roads, where cameras and lights were present. Willow saw the message and smiled, put her phone away. Unaware it would be the last time, that message felt like a gentle reminder. Her steps moved slowly, past a row of old cars parked beside the municipal building. A few middle-aged men sat quietly on a stone bench, silent, as if they were part of the architecture itself. She clutched the books to her chest, sensing something brush her shoulder like a gaze. At the far end of the street, 2 uniformed officers leaned against a vehicle, cigarettes held between their fingers, smoke swirling into odd shapes under the fading light. They said nothing, but one of them looked at her with the same expression she once saw on a boy's face in a diner when she was 16. The boy who claimed a white dress was an unwritten invitation. Willow lowered her head and walked faster, but the sound of footsteps echoed steadily behind her like knocks against her skull. She did not look back, only tightened her grip around the spine of the book. The smell of cigarettes, sweat, and something damp in the air rose all around her, as if the town had started to rot from within, and where she thought Zuri might appear at any moment, there was only a cold emptiness. That message was never answered again, and no icon showed up afterward. No ellipsis, no movement, yet something was drawing closer, silently, step by step. Willow breathed slowly, holding 3 books tightly to her chest, as if they contained something more precious than mere words. Each step echoed with the sound of her heels striking the tiles, a sound that rang out in an unnatural kind of silence, the kind that raised goosebumps across her skin. Her white dress clung gently to her figure, the hem brushing against the breeze like a fragile reminder that the world could be gentle if it chose to be. But today, it seemed to have no such intention. Her hair draped over her shoulders, and the late afternoon sun painted her forehead and nose with a soft golden hue, the kind of light usually reserved for memories, not for signaling looming disaster. Willow turned down a corridor of red bricks, following a line of short trees beside the yard, where patrol cars always parked in an unchanging row. She knew this area wasn't meant for pedestrians, but the main road was under repair, and she didn't want to walk through the neighborhood where graffiti-covered walls still dripped with slurs. This path was shorter, hugging the administrative building's side, and she remembered Zuri once telling her to avoid it. Back then, everything was still bright. The moment she stepped into the clearing between the vehicles, she saw them. 2 officers, one large with bruises along his arms like he made a habit of fighting, the other thinner, his face flushed with either alcohol or something stronger. They leaned against a patrol car, cigarettes flickering between their fingers, the flames dying and sparking again in an endless joke. They saw her the moment she exited the corridor, but neither moved. They stared as if they had been waiting, as if she were the missing piece the afternoon needed to be complete. The thinner one tilted his head slightly, eyes retreating into deep sockets, before sliding outward like a blade peeling skin from her shoulders. Willow subtly adjusted her path, planning to pass between the 2 vehicles and exit onto the main street. But as she took another step, their gaze followed, unblinking. The larger man's eyes froze on her chest, while the other licked his lips, as though reading an obscene paragraph with his eyes. The smell of cigarette smoke hit her as the wind changed, mixed with a sharp odor of sweat and antiseptic. Willow didn't stop, nor did she speed up. She knew any reaction now could become an excuse for something far harder to undo. She tightened her grip on the books, eyes fixed ahead, trying to keep her composure as her chest began to constrict. That nameless feeling had crept in once before, when a stranger followed her from a parking lot to a corner store at 15. That time, the man had walked away when she faked a phone call. This time, there would be no call. Her phone lay at the bottom of her bag, too far to reach if another hand moved faster. The air between her and the two offices thickened, as if someone were pulling a curtain down to block the afternoon light. One of them tilted his shoulder, placed a hand on the hood of the car, and tapped 3 times with his index finger. The metallic knock echoed like a warning, an internal signal she wasn't supposed to understand. Willow kept her chin up, her feet moving, but her mind was gripped by something slow and burning. Only one image remained in her thoughts. Zuri's eyes, dark as a stormy night. The last time they locked, as she said, "If anything feels off, text me right away." But today, her screen stayed silent, and ahead, those 2 stares kept burrowing into her, as if they had the right to decide what she was, who she could be, and how she could be used. Pale as paper, easy to fold. His voice was not loud, but each word landed with a sharp, chilling clarity. Every syllable sliced through the silence like a thin blade, leaving behind a stench that could not be scrubbed away. Willow heard the sentence like a verdict already written, just waiting to be carried out. She did not stop walking, but her heart pounded violently, as if someone were driving nails into her chest from the inside. She lifted her head and looked him straight in the eye, not to challenge, but to confirm whether the man wearing that badge was truly human. His gaze did not flinch. It remained fixed, shameless, contemptuous, as if her very act of meeting his eyes was a mistake. In that brief moment, every decent thing Willow had tried to believe in cracked. She lowered her head, veered to the right, and picked up her pace, hoping distance could serve as a fragile shield. But the sound of leather soles scraping behind her rang out like scissors dragging across tile, steady and relentless enough to chill her spine. The sun tilted behind the buildings, fading light pulling back into elongated shadows that slithered across the street like snakes. Willow crossed the parking lot, her shadow stretching unnaturally long until it touched his boots. She heard a second set of footsteps merge with the first. No one said a word, but that silence was the most terrifying sound she had ever known. Suddenly a hand grabbed the strap of her bag from behind and yanked her backward. She turned instinctively, not yet grasping what was happening, before being shoved against the right side of a car. Her body was pinned between the cold metal and a police uniform reeking of cigarettes and stale liquor. He leaned in so close his breath hit her cheek, pungent enough to sting her eyes. Willow twisted, clutching her stack of books as if it were a useless weapon. He was still laughing, short, clipped bursts, like watching an old, tired comedy clip. His eyes dropped to her dress, then he leaned in further. She backed away slightly, spine slamming into the door handle. The other officer approached, not quickly but with certainty. His gaze flicked to his partner, then back to Willow. His face was blank, but his hand was already resting on the grip of his gun. "You scared?" he asked, voice almost a whisper. "We're here to keep things safe. Who's gonna hurt you?" Then his hand landed on her shoulder, as if to comfort, as if this exchange were legitimate, as if everything happening was part of some authorized script. Willow tried to speak, but her throat was parched. All she could hear was her heartbeat, pounding like a warning against a soundless threat inching closer. She looked around. No one nearby. No one is coming. And the one person she was counting on had yet to respond. Fingers began sliding from her shoulder down her arm, while the other man circled behind her, cutting off escape. It was still daylight, but the light did nothing now. Each breath she took grew heavier, as if the air had turned to ash. She clutched the hem of her dress tightly, but another hand had already begun to move, with unmistakable intent. Inside her, something shattered and caught fire all at once, but her body felt pinned under tons of cement. And just as his shoes shifted, ready to tug at the fabric again, a different sound echoed somewhere nearby. Slow down a bit walking that fast. What are you hiding under your skirt? His voice hissed through clenched teeth, reeking of alcohol and laced with a harsh, barking laugh, each word sounding like a sick joke repeated in a windowless room. Willow froze, partly out of fear and partly because there was nowhere else to go. Her foot had just reached the edge of the open lot when the larger officer's figure slid into view, blocking the way completely. He stood there like a carved stone pillar, one hand resting on the holster in a ready stance, his expression so stiff it bordered on lifeless. He looked less like a person and more like a wooden post planted to signal no passing allowed. Willow could not turn around. Behind her was the heat radiating off a sun-scorched patrol car. In front were two men wearing the same colored uniform, the same mix of contempt and smugness on their faces. Her chest tightened, her breath caught in stuttering waves. The thinner one stepped forward, slowly, like savoring a game that dragged on. "Relax," he said. "We're just doing our job." He glanced at the book she held, smirking. "What are you reading? Criminal law?" She gripped the book tightly, eyes locked on him, but her feet would not move. Her body seemed rooted to the brick ground, as if their presence had drained her ability to respond. He raised a hand, brushing aside a loose strand of her hair, then laughed when she instinctively flinched. "What, the police scare you now? If we see someone acting shady, we check it out. Walking fast like that makes people curious." Willow said nothing. She knew anything uttered now could be twisted into an excuse to prolong what was unfolding. He stepped closer, his breath striking her face, thick with alcohol and something rotting, making her stomach want to recoil. Her hip bumped the police car's door, the metal icy even through fabric, a cruel reminder that this was real, not a nightmare she could wake from. Behind her, the large man shifted his weight, the ground subtly vibrating beneath his boots. His posture hadn't changed, but his grip on the holster tightened slightly. They had done this before, their actions unfolding like a silent play. Willow didn't realize it from their eyes, but from how deliberate the space between them felt. They knew exactly what they were doing. The thinner man paused for a beat, then leaned in close to her ear. "Ever been told that skin as pale as yours scrambles a man's thoughts?" He chuckled again, then, without warning, grabbed the wrist holding her book, twisting it behind her back. At the same moment, the larger man stepped forward half a pace, boxing her against the vehicle. His shadow swallowed the last streak of sunlight from her hair. She gasped, unable to turn. In her left ear was his whisper, in her right the heavy breath closing in. Her movements grew scrambled, no longer under her control, yet chillingly synchronized with their planning. A second later, his hand slipped down the front of her skirt. She reflexively moved to block him, but her arm was already pinned. One side of her dress lifted. In that instant, the sound of boots from a distance cracked like thunder across the brick courtyard. None of the three turned immediately. Only one person was about to step into view, and inside her chest, the only thing left was a tiny knock of hope begging to be heard. The thin man suddenly bent down, his fingers hooking the left hem of her skirt, yanking it upward in a flash. The thin white fabric flew past her knees. Sunlight struck the exposed skin like a slap against dignity. He muttered a sentence, half laughing, half sneering, the words slurred by liquor and hollow authority. "Just a little check, sweetheart. New law allows it." Willow could not tell whether he was joking or serious, whether this was absurdity or legalized indecency. All she heard was a ringing in her ears, not from noise but from the sheer vulgarity of the intrusion. She screamed, but her throat felt wrapped in a thick fog, the sound escaping only as a broken gasp. Her arms still clutched the books to her chest like a shattered shield, her body unable to move. Her feet rooted to the ground, each toe numb, as if clinging to a fragile line between endurance and the panic threatening to erupt. The thin one straightened, narrowing his eyes like he was studying the reaction of a small, trapped animal. He sneered, flicked his hair back, then bent down again, slower this time, more deliberately. Across from him, the larger officer remained still, his eyes cold as stone. His hand stayed on the grip of his gun, a silent reminder of what controlled everything here. Willow tried to swallow her panic, her gaze shifting between the two faces in front of her. She felt as if she were standing on an invisible minefield, every movement, every breath a trigger that could send things plunging into a pit with no way out. But there was no room left to retreat. Her back was pressed against the car, the frigid contours of the metal pressing into her spine. He leaned closer again, this time his lips nearly touching her ear, his whisper carving a grotesque memory into her mind. With skin this white, what are you hiding underneath? I'm just helping you make it public. She jerked her shoulder away, but his hand had already clamped around her thigh, and her knee buckled slightly from fear. Childhood flashes raced through her mind, Zuri's voice saying to be strong, to face things head-on, to never let anyone put their hands on her body without consent. But now there was no Zuri, no one stepping from the shadows. She retreated into herself, the only place left untouched. In her peripheral vision, the sun faded behind distant rooftops, leaving a last strand of light like a severed thread. The wind passed, too weak to blow away the shame clinging to her skin. She wanted to resist, to break free, but no chance appeared. Everything had been calculated. The parked car's position, the space, the gaze too practiced in this kind of contact. He took his time, certain no one would come. He had done this before, and this time would be no different. Willow still said nothing, not from silence, but because her throat had vanished, replaced by a seething, choked fury. Her eyes scanned the lot, hoping for anything different. Suddenly footsteps echoed from beyond the row of cars, heavy, solid, unhurried but resolute, as if each step had purpose. He paused, tilting his head slightly. Willow had no time to turn before her body was yanked leftward, not by his hand, but by something else, stronger, deliberate, and from another direction. A force rushed in, a jolt slammed straight into his face, and this time, no one stood still. So white, but not as sweet as I thought. He leaned in, his mouth so close his breath scraped her hip like a trail of fire. The words were not spoken for conversation, but as a declaration of ownership, as if her body were an object to be raided and ridiculed. He flashed a crooked grin, unapologetically smug, and spoke in a steady tone, each word pressed out like he was grinding her dignity beneath his heel. Willow shivered. Her shoulders clenched, but both arms were already locked behind her. The larger officer held her wrist with a grip not overpowering, yet firm enough to keep her immobile. He leaned close to her ear, his voice thick and low. "Keep still." Resisting is obstructing law enforcement. The words oozed like oil, absent of overt threat but cold as stone. Each syllable tightened another invisible strap around her body. Her face flushed, not from shame, but from a fury rising like steam compressed in a sealed pot. She clenched her teeth, but they rattled from the tremble that began in her spine. The bony hand in front of her grazed the exposed skin near her hem, filthy fingers dragging upward against the grain of the fabric, as if testing the weave, as if measuring territory. His other hand pushed the book off her arm, sending it tumbling to the ground with a hollow thud. Willow tilted her head, locking eyes with him, staring into a look that should never exist behind a badge. He stared back as if she were something stripped of humanity. That gaze held no disguise. It confirmed what she had once refused to believe. Power could twist the law into garbage the moment it stood in front of someone unable to fight back. A quiet laugh slipped from behind her, not loud, but enough to signal the game had gone too far to be concealed. The large man kept his grip, but adjusted position, pressing her harder against the vehicle, her shoulder blades grinding into metal, her face turned sideways under his weight. Silence was no longer a choice. It was the result of prolonged shock. She heard her breath break apart into fragments, sharp and panicked, though no one else seemed to notice. The thin one glanced to his left, pretending to scan the area, then said loud enough to be heard, "Cameras are busted around here, and no one cares who checks what." He turned back to her, fingers once again touching the edge of her skirt. "Don't worry, the police will protect you." The sentence drilled into her chest like a corkscrew. She bit her lip, the flesh inside her mouth crushed between her teeth. She had seen those words on TV, read them in flyers, but when they came from his mouth, they became a blade. A middle-aged woman passed by from across the sidewalk, holding a tote bag printed with sunflowers, her sandals squeaking with each slow step. Her eyes flicked over, pausing for exactly 2 seconds as she saw Willow pinned to the patrol car, skirt flipped, arms held tight by 2 uniformed men. Her brows furrowed, her grip on the bag tightened, and one finger was trembling slightly. She lifted her foot, as if something had cracked inside her. But then she stopped, slid the bag higher on her shoulder, looked away, and kept walking, her heels dragging the sound of helplessness across the paving stones. Willow saw that look. She felt the moment the woman had seen everything. In that fragile second, she thought someone would speak, that a voice might cut through the fear, tightening around her from behind. But the sound of retreating footsteps landed heavier than any blow. The feeling of being abandoned in a swamp where justice and compassion were both absent shattered whatever remained inside her. She broke down without hearing herself. Her throat was parched, tears streamed down without warning, falling onto the back of a hand gripped so tightly it had turned white. In her palm, the marks from earlier nail imprints began to bleed. Blood seeped into the strap of her bag, staining every fiber red. Her book lay tossed beneath the car, its cover dented, a corner crumpled as if someone had stepped on it. But she did not look down, did not have the mind to think about it. She was clinging to the last scraps of clarity, like someone drifting in the ocean, clutching a torn leaf instead of a lifeboat. The thin man's fingers slid once more, reaching the edge of the fabric, trying to pull deeper into where his filthy gaze could not yet reach. Each time his hand moved, her chest tightened, as if being inflated and deflated just to prolong the torment. The larger man behind her kept the same distance, like a silent wall assigned to maintain the stage. No one spoke, but they all knew exactly what they were doing. The repetition of movement, the practiced looks, the measured space, everything felt like an ancient choreography, rehearsed hundreds of times with nameless victims and no witnesses. Willow did not feel physical pain, did not notice the bruise forming on her shoulder, or the pressure of the door handle digging into her back. What she saw most clearly was the moment that woman turned away. The instant the only chance to alter the ending slipped past like smoke in the wind. That silence was the verdict, and she had been sentenced long before. The next second, just as he prepared to pull the fabric up again, heavy, resolute footsteps echoed from behind. He turned instinctively, just in time to see a figure approaching, left hand gripping a utility belt, right hand holding something long, slim, and familiar to anyone who had ever broken rules in uniform. The sound of boots scraping against the pavement sliced through the stifling air like a blade. That sound not only froze the 2 men in place, but also jolted Willow's body, as if someone had just pulled her out of a bottomless pit. A woman's voice roared out, stopping time itself mid-fall. The command didn't travel through her ears, but pierced directly into her chest. "Take your filthy hands off!" There was no warning strike. The baton swung upward in a clean arc, like an axe severing a leash. The thin man's jaw twisted, blood sprang in a streak across the polished patrol car. A scream burst from someone's mouth, though it was unclear whether it came from the attacker or the shock itself being severed midstream. A shadow blocked her view, placing itself between her and the 2 predators. And for the first time since this nightmare began, her breathing steadied. It cracked into a long, stinging rhythm, but still carried life. Willow staggered, her arms pulled from the grip that had locked them, her body collapsing as if someone had yanked out her spine. Another arm caught her, firm and unshaking, carrying the familiar scent of sweat and body armor fresh from the gym. She didn't need to look up or guess. There was only one person who would arrive at the precise moment the nightmare peaked, carrying a presence like a hammer crashing down on the rotting laws that were tearing apart the last teeth of justice. Zuri Hale stood there, shielding Willow completely from the eyes of the 2 men who once held the power of life and death. Her arms still raised, baton clenched, ready to strike again if anyone dared move. She didn't ask what had happened. She had seen enough. And this time, she wasn't here to talk. The thin one turned first, blood still smeared along his cheek, eyes wide in disbelief at what had just struck him. The black uniform slammed into his vision like a stop sign, and the body wearing it stormed toward him like a hurricane. Zuri Hale didn't step. She charged, shoulder dropped, movements precise, boot heels pounding out a rhythm of fury on the bricks. Across her chest, the word "Paulus" blazed in bold letters, branding away every excuse the two men once hid behind. The thin man hadn't even pulled his hand from Willow's skirt before a sweeping kick crashed into his jaw. The sound of impact was dry and decisive, his face tilting hard, body flung left, slamming into the patrol car's hood. The crash splintered the windshield slightly and he groaned through bloodied teeth. Zuri didn't spare him another glance. Her eyes were already on Willow, hand reaching out to steady her folded frame, anchoring her with a firm arm and a gaze that did not waver. The large officer had barely loosened his grip when Zuri spun to block him. He didn't even speak before her baton swung upward, not striking his head or shoulder, but smashing directly into the grip of the gun still resting at his hip. The blow made his hand jerk, the gun popping loose and clattering to the pavement. "I swear, if you bend to pick that up, I'll feed you my badge number with my knee," Zuri said, her eyes blazing, her voice low but crystal clear, each syllable slicing across his face like a blade being tested for sharpness. Willow leaned close to Zuri, both hands still gripping the torn strap of her bag, eyes locked on the back, standing firmly in front of her. She could not see Zuri's face, but she felt the rise and fall of her friend's chest, breaths short but unwavering. That presence made every layer of Willow's skin loosen, millimeter by millimeter, as if everything before had become old wounds, now being bandaged by real action. The larger man stepped back, hands raised to shoulder height. "Hey, Zuri, you're overreacting." Zuri did not lower her baton, but pointed it straight at his chest. "You just stood by while a filthy bastard pulled at my friend's dress in broad daylight." "I haven't overreacted. I'm just getting started. Her jaw clenched as she spoke, eyes fixed on his hand twitching near the edge of his weapon. Zuri's kick spun her body in a precise, ruthless arc. Her foot struck the thin officer's jaw with enough force to jerk his head sideways, his whole frame flung backward like it had been slammed by metal. His back hit the patrol car, then slid down into a crumpled heap on the pavement. Blood burst from his nose in a sharp spray, splattering across the windshield in a deep red smear that looked like a signature no one needed to explain. Willow trembled from shock, but her breathing no longer stuttered. She dropped to her knees, one hand still gripping her bag, the other pressed against the car to regain balance. In front of her, Zuri stood wide-legged, fierce as a furnace ready to scorch everything left behind. Her baton extended with a clean snap, the metallic sound echoing just enough to make the two men understand that things had spiraled beyond their control. "You picked the wrong girl to touch," Zuri hissed through clenched teeth, her voice hoarse but clear, every word heavy enough to drag the air between the parked cars into stillness. "She's the last person you should have laid a finger on." Her grip on the baton tightened, the tip angled low, ready to strike sideways at any moment. Her eyes locked on the remaining officer, who stood frozen, sweat blooming on his forehead despite the fading sun. He stepped back half a pace, as if instinct had yanked him from the blast zone. He looked at Zuri like he could not believe she had struck, but the blood on his partner's face made the truth impossible to deny. He swallowed hard, lifted both hands as if to say it was all a misunderstanding, and muttered, "Take it easy, Hale. Don't make this mess worse." Zuri stepped forward once, her gaze never breaking. "I am taking it easy. You two just walked yourselves into an internal report I'm filing in 10 minutes. Her eyes hardened, lips pressed into a tight line. The air grew thick with tension, as though any wrong move would snap straight into bone. The thin man still twitched on the ground, blood trickling from his nose and mouth, breathing ragged, his fingers scraping across the pavement, searching for something to anchor him. Yet his eyes held nothing but smoldering spite. No guilt, no fear. The larger one bent down, hauling him up with both hands, propping him against the car to stop him from collapsing again. Zuri did not step back, did not speak. Her eyes made the rest of the story irrelevant. Willow stood with the car's help, her legs still shaky, but her gaze steadier. She saw Zuri's back tighten like a shield, blocking every inch of sight between her and the two men who had used uniforms and power to turn her into a toy in a rotting afternoon. In that moment, Willow understood she had not been alone, and Zuri had not come to explain, she had come to end it. Zuri inhaled once, then growled, "If you're still here in 5 seconds, I'll call internal affairs and then the state investigator. Want to be on the morning news or walk yourselves out?" Neither man replied. They staggered off toward the end of the lot, dragging shame and blood behind them, like the price of being outmatched in front of someone they had once seen as prey. Zuri did not watch them leave. She turned to Willow, voice softer now, but just as firm. "It's over. I'm here." Willow nodded, eyes glistening but dry. She stepped forward and placed a hand on her friend's shoulder. In the empty lot, 2 women stood still. One had just come out of hell, one had pulled fire from her chest to burn it down, and between them there was no space left for anyone to stand. On the faded concrete of the parking lot, between the bloodstains still clinging to the patrol car's windows and the chaotic footsteps that had just retreated, the late afternoon light slid across the edge of a hidden sign at the side of the building. The metal sign, its lettering worn and warped by time, hung crooked on a rusted iron pole. The words, "No Parking Zone," had almost entirely peeled away, but what caught Zuri's attention was not the text. It was a tiny red light blinking steadily beneath the lower edge. It was small, dim, camouflaged by dust and glare, but still alive. Zuri narrowed her eyes, stepping closer, her boots clicking against the tiles in a silence so deep it made every sound sharp. "Infrared camera," she muttered, though her voice betrayed a rising alertness. "The kind embedded by administrative security. Blind spot but still active." Willow stood behind her, not fully recovered from the shock. Her fingers clutched the torn strap of her bag, eyes following Zuri with a vacant stare that slowly turned questioning. She didn't speak, but every step Zuri took toward the pole told her the incident hadn't ended with a kick or a threat. Something had been watching. Zuri tilted her head, inspecting the setup again, confirming the camera's angle, height, and the timing of light reaching its lens. She didn't speak immediately, only stepped back half a pace and raised her phone to take wide shots of the scene. She left out nothing: the corroded metal plate, the elongated shadow from the post stretching across the cement, the location of the patrol car where blood hadn't yet dried. After saving the images, she opened a mapping app, pinned the coordinates, and synced the data to a personal storage device tucked in her chest pocket. Every move was clean and swift, like someone who had done this too many times without ever feeling relief. "It may have captured the entire thing," Zuri said, eyes fixed on the screen, voice devoid of emotion, but her jaw was tense. She knew these devices didn't record freely. They only activated with significant motion or sounds beyond the preset threshold. She turned and locked eyes with Willow, not to comfort but to confirm. Willow stepped forward, her wrists still aching from being restrained. "Are you sure?" she asked, voice low and dry. "Sure, it's enough to testify." Zuri nodded slightly, her fingers skimming the screen to save the time and location. "If they haven't deleted it yet, then yes." She circled the post, checking the hidden wiring, silver cables tucked under a cracked metal lid. A telltale sign of an older model, but one still capable of internal storage before sending data elsewhere. That meant the footage resided at the central security hub, the system managing all administrative surveillance. Zuri looked toward the government building a few hundred meters away, its stacked windows like rows of eyes pretending to be asleep. Willow remained still behind her, but now with her eyes closed, weighing something heavy. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of metal from the vehicle barrier. She inhaled deeply, then asked, "If they know the camera caught it, they'll erase it, right?" Zuri didn't turn, she just nodded. "We need to be faster. We need a copy before they interfere." Willow said nothing. She tightened her grip on the ripped strap, the cold in her palm unchanged since blood had soaked through the fabric. She watched Zuri work, saw the tendons in her wrist sharply. Every movement was precise, with no wasted motion, as if Zuri were reconstructing the entire scene, not to file a report, but to prepare for war. A breeze swept past, carrying dust across the pavement, pushing Willow's hair back. She took a step backward, eyes still fixed on the sign with the camera, where the only sign of life now was a tiny red blink, like a signal from the edge of an abyss. She had never wanted to become the center of something serious, But if what had just happened had truly been recorded, if every look, every shove, every whisper had been preserved as living evidence, then maybe this time the truth would not be buried like all the times before. Zuri closed the app, tucked the phone into her jacket pocket, and then walked toward Willow. I need to get inside headquarters to check the original archive. This copy's good, but it can't be the only one. We need an official chain of custody from the system. She paused for a second, her eyes leaving no room for argument. All it takes is one person inside to erase everything. Catherine? Shane? Yes? Principal. Willow swallowed, her throat still raw, but her voice was steadier. I'm going with you. Zuri gave a slight nod. She knew the woman standing before her would not back away again. They turned, walking away from the parking lot where the afternoon had become testimony. Behind them, the shadows of the two offenders had disappeared into the line of office buildings, carrying with them the cloak of power they once believed untouchable. On the way, Zuri activated a covert transmission device, linking directly to the internal station and tracing a path toward the primary data vault. She said nothing more, her mind running through each scenario. Someone would try to stop it, someone would deny it, someone would submit a different report, but among all those possibilities, she held on to one bright point. The footage had been captured at the right moment. Light does not lie, and if those images were made public today, there would be nothing left for the two of them to deny. Zuri curled her fingers into a fist, feeling the heat rise at her fingertips. This time, she had not come to warn. She had come to trigger a reckoning, and it had just begun. The next morning, the air inside the police department was as heavy as mist caught in the throat. Staff moved as usual, with the tapping of keyboards, phones ringing, and footsteps echoing across the tiled corridors. But every gaze shifted when Zuri appeared at the entrance of the administrative office, a personal data bag slung over her shoulder, her eyes sharp as blades. She didn't avoid them. She walked straight down the middle, like a blade stabbing into the heart of a system long hardened. As she passed the third row of desks, the large officer emerged from the far right corner, where the printers sat flush against the wall. He moved toward her as if he had been waiting, his steps heavy, breath snorting like rage being stuffed back down his throat. His face flushed red, uncertain if it was anger or the slow creep of fear. He blocked her path to the commanding officer's door, then growled, "Zuri, don't make me call your cousin." His voice burst toward her like a verbal punch, drawing glances from three nearby officers. The mention of her cousin was not random. Anyone long enough in the department knew Lieutenant Mark Heller, the man who held sway over the internal security system and had quashed more than a few complaints before they could stink up the air outside. Zuri stopped directly in front of him, her head slightly tilted, her gaze unwavering. Without the slightest flinch, she stepped forward, close enough for their chests to nearly touch. The air between them held just enough space for a threat, but her voice was low, slicing like scissors grazing a throat. "Go ahead. I'll send the footage along with my greetings." He stepped back on instinct. His hand near his waist slackened, veins rising across the back of it. In his eyes, Zuri was no longer a colleague. She was a direct threat, wrapped in calm and forged in real fury. Those used to towering over others' fear always trembled when they realized they had misjudged their target. A young officer came through the hallway behind them, slipping past without a word. Zuri stood still, her eyes locked on the larger man. A tense silence hung thick in the air. Only their stare remained, burning away the pretense that had long shielded a system rotten to its core. The big man tightened his grip on his holster, then let out a dry laugh, the kind that couldn't mask its derision. "I warned you. Don't say I didn't." Zuri smirked, but didn't answer. She stepped past him, her shoulder brushing his arm as she went, never once looking back. At the commanding officer's door, she stopped, straightened her collar, and knocked 3 times. The door opened, and she walked in, as if already prepared to confront not just one incident, but the entire hierarchy backing it. The 2 officers lumbered down the stone-tiled corridor, their massive frames making the floor echo with the thud of boots like mallets against cement. Even out of earshot, they turned their heads, eyes burning as if eager to toss more ash into the open wound still seething. One of them spoke, the words dragging out like iron chains scraping across pride already bruised. Traitor, you're burning yourself down, Hale." That sentence was not just mockery, it was a curse, a bitter resentment buried beneath the uniform once used to silence others. They had grown used to a system where stains were swept under rugs, where wrongdoing could be erased with a single phone call. But this time, the one they expected to protect the circle of silence was the very person who shattered it, with a kick and a string of digital evidence. Zuri did not turn around. She had heard every word, clear enough to strike her back like sharp, cold needles. But instead of responding, she quickened her pace toward the Internal Affairs Office, where she needed to file an incident report and issue an urgent request to preserve camera footage. Her eyes stayed forward, but her spine tightened with every step, carrying a blend of fury and resolve. Words like those she had heard since childhood, when her father, a black man in uniform, was called a traitor to his ancestors just for standing upright in the face of injustice. And now, those voices repeated in a vicious loop she had sworn to break. In Zuri's mind, the footsteps of those two officers still echoed like drums struck in reverse. She did not need to look back to know their stride was no longer proud. It was the posture of men who knew they had broken rules, but still clung to power like a last shell for intimidation. That kind of power, Zuri had once believed in it. She used to think uniforms protected the weak and unmasked the wicked. But when she saw uniforms shielding the sickness of their own, she realized that unless the shell was ripped away, justice would remain a hollow banner. Zuri opened the investigation room door without a glance behind. In the pale, air-conditioned silence, pressured by the weight of what it held, she placed her bag on the table and stated the facts to the on-duty officer. Every detail was laid out: time, location, camera feed, and the exact timestamp where the recording began. She skipped not a single second, added no emotion. She did not need sympathy. What she needed was traceability, data sealed, and an internal disciplinary file that would not disappear like the cases before. Behind the glass door, the two officers vanished into the crowd, but their words clung like grime to her collar, too stubborn to wash away in one morning. Backstabber. That phrase, Zuri knew, was the clearest sign she had touched what they feared most: the truth, seen, recorded, and about to be exposed. And because of that, her steps grew firmer, her chest fuller. If the price of siding with justice was being branded a traitor, then she would be the most brilliant traitor they had ever seen. In the command room, Zuri set her bag down, activated the device, and began presenting timestamps, coordinates, images, and video copies. Her voice never wavered. She had nothing to prove beyond the fact that everything had been witnessed, documented, and that someone was ready to bring it to light. Morning at the precinct had never felt heavier, but to Zuri it was the first real dawn. The next morning, a sudden notice interrupted Zuri's shift. The message from the administration was a single sentence, but it drew every line on her forehead taut. Report to the command office. Urgent. She did not reply, only took off her gloves, adjusted her belt, and left the patrol car. The command office door was already ajar, and inside, an atmosphere of waiting had been set. Lieutenant Colonel Pearson sat behind the desk, thick glasses masking most of his expression, but his voice was as cold and sharp as a slap. "We need to review your overreach," he said, fingers drumming the folder in front of him. "No authorization, no report to superiors, and you used force on fellow officers." Zuri stood upright, hands folded neatly in front of her. "I intervened in a situation where a citizen was being publicly harassed by two men in police uniforms." Her voice was calm, steady, and clear. Not a challenge, but an affirmation. Every word landed like a pebble striking the moral mask stretched over the system. Pearson did not answer right away, only flipped through the folder, each page crackling in the quiet. Across town, Willow had just finished brewing tea when her phone rang. Not a call, but a message. The screen flashed white, an unknown number. She frowned, opened it. 4 words. Short, raw. "Do you have another skirt?" She froze in the kitchen, fingers squeezing the phone until the screen bore her prints. The question was not about clothing, but about reopening wounds not yet healed. It was how someone tried to shove her back into the victim's role, dragging shame into the house like a sick joke. Her heart clenched. Breath came in jolts. Willow glanced around the tiny home. every painting, every book, once a refuge from the world outside. No, even he was pulled into the filthy current of invisible power. She did not reply. Her hands moved by reflex, opening the Notes app, saving the number, forwarding it to the civilian security tip line that Zuri had installed for her. She knew the game was not over. A kick in the parking lot would not silence them. It only forced them to change tactics. Zuri faced Pearson, hands unmoving. He shifted, leaning back to create a buffer of authority. "I will request the investigation unit hold the video copy for review." Zuri tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "The copy has been stored on 3 independent systems. I've also sent a cross-check to outside legal counsel. You'd best look at the full context before you decide to erase anything." Pearson sighed, showing a rare flash of resignation in his eyes. He was not surprised. Zuri had never acted like someone easy to manipulate, but this time he sensed it more clearly. She was no longer just resisting, she was openly declaring war. When Zuri left the command room, clouds had sunk low, the sky thick and gray like old paint stuck to the police station's ceiling. She knew those people were not finished. The messages sent to Willow were only the first bait. But this time, she would not go alone. What had been preserved now was not just images but evidence of how they reacted after exposure. In a world of rules where any gap can be erased, data and time were the bullets she kept ready in her pocket. While the station was wrapped in a heavy mist of caution and silence, Zuri sat alone inside a patrol car parked near the empty lot behind the administration wing. She opened her encryption app, pulled up a backup clip from a secured storage drive, and selected only the portion that clearly showed the thin officer pulling Willow's dress and the cold stare of the man restraining the victim. She added, "No comments, no sensational headlines, only attach the audio and a line. Start here, and you'll see why they want this gone." The recipient was Sasha Nix, an independent reporter well known for her investigative work into law enforcement protection rings. Many in the system saw her as a thorn in their side. Zuri called her a blade sunk deep into rot. They had never met in person, but Zuri had sometimes sent her anonymous data to help Sasha trace the links. Every article ended with a shuffle of seats somewhere, small but enough to make insiders frown. A faint blue "received" checkmark showed on the message, and no immediate reply. Zuri did not need one. She knew Sasha would not delay if the stench reached her nose. She leaned her head against the window, eyes half closed, mind drifting to a name that had surfaced at the early morning meeting. Lieutenant Mark Heller. That name ran through her mind like a hidden saw, quiet but leaving a clear tear behind. Not everyone had the authority to control the surveillance system in the administrative block. Heller was not a face in the regular force, but full access to the system was his. More importantly, he was the cousin of the big officer, the one who had pinned Willow's arms as if handling a wild animal, not an attacked human being. Camera data could be wiped, verification orders could be blocked, but blood ties were not so easy to hide. Zuri could see his footprints on every extracted log, the way files were fragmented, the way a 15-minute video shrank to 3 minutes of blurry footage. If there had been no personal backup from the infrared angle, that video would have vanished right after that night. She reopened the internal log, reviewed every data access request from the storage center. Heller's name showed up 3 times, always during the period when case files were briefly accessed and quickly closed. She made a note, saved login codes, and then transferred everything to a separate secure backup. Her fingers typed steadily, sending a data comparison to the legal advisor while activating a double-layer alert for every related file. Willow was reading the same names, but from her home computer. After last week's junk message, she had installed all the security systems Zuri recommended, and for the first time in months, she did not feel powerless sitting alone before the screen. She saw the name Mark Heller that Zuri had just sent, then opened a new tab to search for Sasha Nix's old articles. Within minutes, she found 2 incidents where Heller had intervened. Both dropped for lack of video evidence. The pattern was the same. Camera data vanished, witnesses left unprotected, everything ending with insufficient grounds for prosecution. Willow rested her hand on the mouse, heart pounding, then pressed forward to send all the information to Sasha with a single line. "There's another victim, but this time we have evidence." The screen glowed like a sign, and for the first time since that day, the trembling in her hands did not come from fear. It came from hope. Hope, sharp as a blade, refusing to let silence become the ending. A week after submitting all backup copies and investigation reports, Zuri was called into the Human Resources office. A bland voice from the personnel manager announced her redeployment by order of the command board. She was assigned to the device monitoring unit, a department responsible for checking, calibrating cameras, radios, and internal security equipment. The reason, listed in the record, to ensure neutrality during the review of personal conduct. Zuri did not object. She did not sign any refusal. But as she left the office, only one line echoed in her mind. This was how they silenced those who still held the data. How the system isolated anyone who got too close to the truth. The device monitoring unit was a place no one paid attention to, cut off from the community, without streets, without people, just machines and a checklist of equipment waiting for inspection, a job they hoped would slowly drain her energy. Her new room was on the ground floor, its walls painted a dull color, the only sound that of air conditioning. She looked at the pile of devices on the table, sensing the silent mockery. They could not strip her badge, nor dismiss the evidence, but they could banish her to the loneliest corner. And when she was no longer present in public, her voice would fade from memory. They called it reassignment. For Zuri, it was exile. Meanwhile, elsewhere in town, Willow was busy preparing a talk at her old high school. The poster outside the hall read clearly, "Memory, Belief, and the Reason to Stand Tall." At first, she planned to speak to just a few groups of female students, but as word spread, the registration exceeded expectations. Not only students, but former teachers, parents, and even a few administrative staff members wanted to attend. Some local radio stations even requested to record and broadcast her talk in the evening. Willow stood on the small stage, a faded projection screen behind her. She did not read from notes or use a prepared speech. She simply told the story, each detail, every moment, from the first glance of the thin officer at her skirt to the thunderous kick Zuri delivered. She did not skip the crude remarks, nor the vacant look of the man who once blocked her path on the schoolyard. That year, she paused, scanning the audience. They called me and Zuri a sick friendship, because we were different colors but dared to hold hands. Today, I tell this story because I cannot let anyone else have to hold their breath, afraid of being labeled, just because they refuse to stay silent. There were sniffles from the front row. An old teacher pressed a tissue to her eyes. The 9th grade girl who once sat beside Willow squeezed her friend's hand. Willow did not rally for a protest or demand instant action, but her words were like a steady rain, soaking slowly into the listeners' minds. The story became a smoldering flame creeping into walls too long accustomed to silence. When the talk ended, a group of students rushed to embrace Willow, unprompted. One whispered, "I'll remember your words." Another asked, "Your friend Zuri? Where is she now?" Willow bent down, smiled gently. "She's right where they thought she'd be, snuffed out." But they forgot that a flame, the more you suffocate it, the deeper it burns. Outside, the old graffiti "Toxic Friendship" that had once been scrawled on the wall was now replaced by a new sign in white paint. Zuri and Willow, witnesses of justice. Words can be erased, but memories, once spoken aloud, live longer than any slogan. On Tuesday morning, when Zuri reopened the backup data folder on the auxiliary server, a cold notification appeared at the center of the screen. "File not found." She blinked, stepped back as if punched in the chest. All the infrared camera extracts from the administrative block had vanished entirely from both the main and backup directories in the internal system. Every upload ever made to the server gave access errors, and even her login was temporarily disabled. A cold bead of sweat slid down her spine. That was the original data, the only living proof against the two officers. She stood frozen in a room heavy with the scent of circuit dust dust and burnt plastic, the whir of the ventilation fan echoing in her head. The old shame returned, as if every kick she had thrown that day was being pulled back, leaving her legs empty and cold. Zuri grabbed her phone, instantly opened her encryption app, and messaged Sasha Nix. Data lost. Check the archival comparison. Immediate verification needed. In less than 3 minutes, Sasha replied with a screenshot of an audio record identifier, the same image Zuri had saved when she found the hidden camera. It showed a string of geometric symbols and numbers, hand-marked, matching the kind of code the security system used for secret files. Sasha wrote, "There's a hidden backup. The system temporarily masked it as internal asset not for release. I'm extracting a draft copy." Zuri shot up from her chair, hands trembling not from fear but from rage. They could not erase it. They could only pretend nothing had happened. But that screenshot of the code had become her lifeline, and this time she was grateful for having learned a survival rule in the business: nothing exists without an independent copy. While Sasha was recovering and encrypting the original file, something else began to spread beyond all expectation. From a small post on a law student forum, where a user reposted the video excerpt with the title, "They call this an administrative check," a small hashtag appeared. 3 hours later, it was trending statewide on Twitter. By midnight, it had surpassed 300,000 shares. Skirt justice. The first person to use the phrase was a second-year media student who wrote, "One kick for the truth, one skirt for justice." Just a simple line, but thousands of accounts started using it to recount their own experiences of being violated, ignored, dismissed for lack of evidence. Under each post was a real profile picture, mostly women, but also men, people of color, immigrants, survivors of abuse, within the very systems meant to protect them. Zuri read each of those spreading lines on her screen, pausing longer when she saw Willow's name described as the bravest survivor in Granith, while she was called the only cop to kick at silence. She did not smile. This was not satisfaction, but recognition. For the first time in years, she knew her actions had not faded into oblivion. Willow read those lines too, one hand scrolling her phone, the other resting on an old book. She did not need to say anything. It was enough to know that this time, her story was not twisted, not labeled just a minor incident. It had become a symbol, and with the reach of a symbol, the system could no longer pretend everything was intact. What had started as a skirt lifted in daylight had now torn away the moral cloak that an entire institution once used to hide its stain. Zuri checked her phone at 3 in the morning, eyes still blurry from exhaustion. A new alert appeared from an unregistered address, just the code S34800 at the end. The message was brief and direct. They did this to a 14-year-old girl 3 years ago. Same parking lot. Attached was a digital record from a temporary archive, a never-publicized internal complaint. The girl's name was Lyra Adams, a 9th grader at Marshall High School. They had found her curled up in a public restroom after class, nails bloody at the edge of her skirt, unable to form words. Zuri sat silent on the wooden bench in the tech room, screen light reflecting off tense cheekbones. From the deepest part of her gut, frustration seeped into every vein. Lyra was never mentioned by anyone. Her name was buried with a file stamped insufficient evidence. There were no images in the record. The cameras that day had a complete malfunction. The supervisor that day was Mark Heller. Zuri placed her hand on the desk, typing back, "Who are you?" No response came. The read indicator never appeared. The message sat there, a frozen streak of blood, cold and inert. She saved all the information, encrypting it twice, and sending a copy to Sasha. She printed 3 pages herself, slipping them into her private folder. One stain had been erased, but the clues had not vanished. Meanwhile, Willow typed slowly, as if each word were dragged out of her chest. She wrote not from rage, but from a feeling like a knife, slowly cutting into memory. Her post began simply, "If someone pulls up your skirt, you scream, but if they have a badge, what should you do?" The question was not to seek an answer, but to peel away the fear of being trapped between duty and conscience. She did not describe the event, nor did not name the attacker. Instead, she wrote about the feeling of wind moving across her legs. the hem yanked from her body like a torn rag. She wrote about the eyes of bystanders turning away as if guilt could evaporate by looking elsewhere. Beneath the post, comments poured in. One read, "I was there. I did not scream. My nerves went numb. The words stuck in my throat." Another said, "Thank you for naming what I have never dared to mention." Willow's question was shared over 20,000 times in just 3 hours, reprinted in the evening news on 2 local TV stations, picked up as a sidebar headline in one of Sasha's reports about the mysterious disappearance of internal data. Willow sat in front of the screen, responding to no one. She just read. Sometimes her eyes landed on stories about other girls in other states, pinned to walls by people they had trusted for safety. Fragments of memory, once shattered, were now being joined by thousands who had thought they were alone. They did not need to know the perpetrator's name. They needed to know that truth could exist beside silence and eventually surpass it. Zuri entered a closed-door meeting with internal teams and a temporary legal advisor. She placed Lyra's file on the table, pointed at the signature on the data deletion order, and needed no more words. The legal counsel lifted the file, looking at the commander with an open frown. One brick had just been pulled from the system's foundation, and from outside that door, questions like Willow's post continued to echo, rapping at every layer of wall still standing, as if nothing had ever shaken it. The hall was packed. They had not come to cheer or applaud. They had come because someone had finally dared to name what they had all quietly folded away in memory. Willow stood at the edge of the stage, drawing a deep breath. The spotlight made the white bandage on her left hand stand out against her dark clothes. Beneath the bandage, scratches from her fingernails were not yet healed. It did not hurt as it did at first, but a dull ache lingered, as if her body was still reminding her of that moment every second. In the front row, a group of high school girls in uniform sat with straight backs. Some older teachers still remembered Willow and Zuri from their days at this school. They had once been the subject of gossip, their handshakes called strange for crossing the color line. Today, no one whispered. Everyone waited to see what the girl, once forced to change seats for befriending the wrong way, would say. Willow stepped up to the podium, a slip of paper in hand, but not looking at it. Her eyes swept the rows, as if every person was worth seeing. She began with a voice that was clear, neither loud nor soft, just enough to reach the last row without needing the microphone adjusted. "I used to think justice lived in the badge, in the uniform, in the people called protectors of the community." Her voice clipped briefly. "About last week, someone wearing that very uniform put his hand up my skirt. The other stood behind, hand on his gun, and no one stopped them." She paused. The air grew thick. A girl in the middle squeezed her hands together. Willow continued, her tone lower now, but as sharp as ink drawing on a page. "Justice does not live in the police logo. Justice begins with who dares to stop the hand reaching for the innocent. Who dares to break the silence when everyone else turns away? Justice does not begin by asking who has the authority, but by asking who has a conscience." There was the faint scrape of a chair on the left, but no one left. Some bowed their heads. Willow went on, not telling details, but sharing fragments of feeling. The sensation of being caught between two big bodies, the wind on her skin, and the harsh laughter of someone still protected by the system. She did not speak through tears. She did not call for revenge. She told her story so everyone would reflect on their place, whether on the outside or standing close by. When Zuri appeared, she did not ask what law applied, did not demand proof. She acted, because she understood that sometimes, when the law cannot react in time, people must speak first. The hall was silent, so silent even breath seemed held back. Willow looked at her bandaged hand, then up again. "The last time I was labeled a toxic friend, I stayed silent. Today, I am silent no longer. Not for myself, but for Lyra Adams, whose name was never heard. For those you once knew, once doubted, but never asked. And for those sitting here who could be next." When she left the podium, no one applauded. Faces were lowered, hands clenched. Slow tears fell, and these echoed more loudly than any ovation. That day, Granith was silent no longer. It had begun to listen. And from listening, people began to remember. to remember that justice, in the end, is not just a name, it is action. It is the right word at the right time. It is someone standing up when everyone else sits still. The closed meeting room on the third floor had no windows. The walls were lined with soundproofing, the long table covered with pale laminate, enough to make every eye wander when they met. Zuri entered when everyone was already seated, holding a copy of the documents, eyes fixed on the man at the center, Lieutenant Mark Heller. He nodded slowly, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment his whole life. No one spoke right away. Only the quiet hiss of the air conditioner and the glow of fluorescent lights reflected off the row of fountain pen tips, lying in a perfect line. Heller lifted the file in front of him, deliberately turning each page slowly, as if to underline that he was still the one in control of this room. When he reached the last page, he stared at Zuri, his lips curling into a faint smile, cold as the ice in unfinished whiskey. "You think you can drag me out of this seat with a video clip and a few hashtags?" He leaned back, arm resting on the chair. "I built this security system. If you dare come after me, don't blame the system for biting back." Zuri did not blink or look at anyone else. She placed her file on the table, immediately turning to the page with Lyra Adams's name highlighted. "You were the one who reviewed the camera report on September 14th, 3 years ago. You also signed the statement, 'Technical malfunction. Data unrecoverable.'" She slid the file right to the edge of the table in front of him. "That girl had no one then, but today I do?" The whole room fell silent, as if the air had been squeezed out for a moment. An older officer to the right frowned, his hand pausing on the file cover. Another checked his watch, then looked up, silent and steady. Zuri's phone vibrated softly in her pocket. She opened the message without hiding it. The sender's name was clear, Sasha Nix. The content was a single line, but it gave solid ground beneath her feet. Helm of those 2 officers was transferred out of District 8 last year after an incident with a 10th grade girl, but the record was removed from database number 3. Zuri reread it to be sure she had missed nothing. No name duplicated, no code mistaken. Everything had been checked. She tapped the tabletop, staring at Heller. "You cannot erase everything." Heller laughed, this time the sound openly challenging. "You think the press, social media, and some tears from a white girl will shake this system?" He stressed white girl with a nasal sneer, his gaze sweeping around for agreement. Zuri did not answer him. She tilted her head, looking straight at the in-house attorney at the head of the table. "I have more data. There are witnesses ready to testify. And now I have the system's fingerprint." She paused. "Someone here will have to choose a side. I'll say this only once." The lawyer did not answer right away. He pulled out a pen, drew a line on the paper in front of him, and nodded slightly. "Send everything to me. All the recordings, every witness's name. We'll reopen the files, at least for the District 8 case." Zuri nodded. As she left the room, she felt the air behind her heavy as stone. But her steps did not slow. She did not need luck wishes. What she had was data, real names, wounds not yet washed clean, and this time, no one would be allowed to write it off as a technical glitch. Willow sat quietly in a cafe near the Granith Tribune office, where she and Sasha had arranged to meet for the first time. The tea before her was cold, the last light of day casting dark gold across the table through the glass. On her laptop screen, the face of Lieutenant Mark Heller appeared in an old news article, saved as a scanned image. He had been the security supervisor at Marshall School when she was in 7th grade. That name had once shown up on the warning slip she was forced to sign for wearing a blue plaid skirt, the regulation uniform, but marked as distracting to male students. She remembered that morning exactly. On a fall day, she was called into the security office as she walked the hallway. A white man with thinning hair, his voice flat as a machine. "Do you know how many inches your skirt is above your knees?" She had stood there, cheeks burning with shame, not even sure what rule she had broken. Heller was the one who signed that report, not just once. That year, Willow was called into the office 3 more times for reasons linked to her clothes, while none of the boys ever were. Willow studied his face in the photo. His expression had not changed much. The difference was that back then he wore a security cap. Now he wore a lieutenant's insignia. A man who went from controlling student dress codes to controlling cameras in public corridors. The same hand that once pointed at the hem of girls' skirts was now the hand with the key to security data. She sent the photo to Zuri with a note. He was the one who wrote me up for wearing a regulation skirt. Zuri replied immediately with a call. Her voice tight. He doesn't just hide his crimes. He builds a whole network to make them look normal. Each word came through her teeth like steel hooks. Every warning, every file pulled, every tape spliced, every kid threatened into silence, he weaves them into a web and sits at the center. Willa lowered her head onto her hand, old bandage lines still imprinted on her palm. She realized she was no longer just a victim, but a witness to an entire hidden system. Heller was not a lone abuser. He was one thick link from school to station to data networks and the halls of power. This was no longer about one man's acts, but a mechanism covered by rules, standards, and years of silence. Zuri sent over a summary file marked with 3 red boxes: Marshall School, District 8, City Administration. All 3 had Heller's name attached as supervisor or approver. She added, "He's not alone, but he's the node. Bring him down, and the whole thing unravels." Illo printed every record, compiling a thick dossier. She stayed in the cafe until evening, watching the streetlights spill onto the brick sidewalk. Through the glass, every window now seemed to reflect someone violated, while others stayed quiet. Every uniform now carried the risk of hiding something, unless someone forced it to answer, "Why did you touch that?" She called an old friend, now reporting for the local news. For the first time in years, she talked about being written up at 13 for a non-standard hymn. The first time she named the man who had made her shrink away through high school. When the call ended, she sat for a long time. The granite night grew cold, but her heart was burning. That network had just been pierced by a sharp needle. Memory would not stay silent, and once the truth is named, it begins to spread on its own. The morning in Granith began with a stab to the heart of trust. The local Granith Sentinel, which rarely challenged the police system, suddenly published a half-front page article with a bold headline that slapped every effort in the face. Officer Zuri Hale, risking her life to attack her colleagues. Directly beneath the title was a photo cropped from the footage that day, showing Zuri kicking the thin officer, blood streaming from his nose. But what stunned readers was not the image, but the cold caption underneath. No provocation could be determined before this incident. Zuri stared at the newspaper for nearly a minute in silence. She set it on the table like someone laying down an indictment with the wrong name, then walked to the coffee maker, pressing the button with a finger still bruised. Every word in the paper seemed written in ink mixed with her blood. It was a brazen inversion, turning the victim into a threat, justice into a personal vendetta. That was not the end. When Zuri turned on the TV in the unit's break room, a brief segment replayed the morning press conference. At the city police podium, a white man in a dress uniform, nameplate Bennett, the department's media liaison, spoke clearly for the cameras. After reviewing all internal files, we have not found any evidence confirming misconduct by the 2 officers involved. He paused, letting the sentence hang, then continued in a deliberate tone, "We understand public concerns, but the information currently circulating has not been officially verified." Zuri turned off the screen. She did not scream. She sat, pulled out her phone, and opened the latest message from Sasha Nix. "Do not let mainstream media redefine the story. We have the data. Release the raw files today." She typed a short reply. "Send it. Include the audio clip and still image comparison." Within minutes, Sasha's independent account published an article titled, "Blood on the abuser's face is not the question. The victim's bruised hand is the answer." Below were close-ups of blood on Willow's shirt, still frames from the extracted infrared camera, and the witness testimony Zuri had recorded on the first day. All data were time-stamped, with location and lighting perfectly matching the context. Willa, reading the article, stood at her room's window, holding a mug of milk gone cold. She did not feel satisfied. She felt bitter, because justice seemed to be something you had to wrestle for, line by line, click by click, frame by scrutinized frame. Every right thing fought as if it had been born from a mistake, but at least this time they were not on the losing side. Zuri was not alone. Willa was not cut from the story, and those once silenced began to peel the tape from their mouths. That same day, a new hashtag appeared, simply Zuri, not to glorify, but to protect. A network of those abused, those once silent, those once labeled traitor to the team, began to speak up, share clips, rewrite old stories. It all began with one kick, one drop of blood, one person standing between and saying, "Stop." But to keep that truth from being distorted, they had to write faster than the mainstream media. They had to speak clearer than the system that claimed the right to deny. And this time, they were ready. Willow walked through the produce section with a shopping basket half empty. Her head was down, her steps slow, as if every corner of the supermarket held a judging stare. Each time she looked up, she caught at least one strange glance. Someone pretended to pick out fruit, but watched her every move. Someone whispered to a friend, then let out a quiet laugh. They did not need to speak loudly. Just a long enough, cold enough look was more tormenting than 100 insults. She knew the rumors were everywhere. That morning, passing the newsstand by the convenience store, a headline hit her like a slap. Victim or actress. Below was a photo of her at the supermarket exit, hand covering her face, shoulders shaking. The tabloid added another line, Willow Reese crying because her skirt was pulled or because her story is falling apart. She remembered that moment. That day, in the supermarket, she had accidentally seen a dress identical to the one torn that afternoon. Her hand shook as she touched it. A wave of memory hit, no warning, no defense. Tears came, not for show, not for pity, simply because her body remembered the shame in every cell. But for those clinging to prejudice, even real tears were called staged. She hurried to the checkout, forcing her back straight. Behind her, the click of a camera phone sounded like a knife to the neck. The man next to her pretended to check his phone, but his eyes lingered on her face a second too long. She bit her lip, walked straight to her car, and drove away, not remembering the route she took. That afternoon, Zuri came by. She brought nothing but a bag of bread and a bottle of water. The two of them sat at the table in silence for a long time. Willow said nothing. She did not need to. Her eyes were red, her lower lids still wet. Zuri set the water on the table, then looked up at her friend. Her eyes were no longer sharp like in the meeting room, nor tense like when facing colleagues. They were deep, bright, and desperate, in the way of someone who understands every trap, yet walks forward anyway. We cannot control their words, Zuri said slowly, her voice soft but clear. We cannot stop their cameras from aiming at us when we are weakest. But there is one thing we can do. Willow looked up, lips pressed tight. When the truth is called a lie, Zuri went on, there's only one thing left. Shout until they cannot pretend to be deaf. She did not wait for Willow to answer. She picked up her phone, turned on the mic and set it in front of Willow, not like a reporter, but like a friend saying, now it's your turn to speak. Willow sat still for a few seconds. She placed her hand on the table, for the first time not hiding the bandaged marks. She looked at the phone's screen, then began, slowly. That day, I was just heading home from the library. Each word came out clearer than she expected. Where she once cried, now there was only her voice. The stairs outside no longer made her hands tremble. She was not telling it to justify, but to reclaim ownership of the story. Not a victim and certainly not an actress. A living witness, fully aware of being touched, insulted, and surviving. No shadowy camera angle, no twisted headline could steal this voice again. Not ever again. Malcolm sat with one leg on the table, twirling a small USB stick between his fingers as if spelling out a secret. The room he worked in was once an old storage closet at headquarters, now turned into a self-made underground base. The scent of coffee mixed with electronic glue, the green light from a bank of monitors along the back wall, made it look more like a crime lab than the workspace of someone once erased for not fitting the organizational culture. Zuri glanced around, eyes sweeping over tangled cables like exposed veins, then stopping at a keyboard without any letters left. "Are you sure you can do this?" she asked. Malcolm grinned and tapped a few keys. "I helped design the encryption system for the very cameras they use. Data recovery is only hard if you believe the system deletes things. But here, nothing is ever truly gone. They just hide it under a layer of mud and call it a technical error." Zuri stepped closer, watching lines of code stream by. Malcolm pulled up a file with the same ID Zuri once captured from the camera above the no parking sign. The file was unusually large, showing it had never been trimmed. "The time matches when she screamed," Zuri whispered. Malcolm nodded, opened the video, and scrolled frame by frame. The screen showed the lot behind the administrative building, sunlight glittering on the pavement, and a girl with loose hair, a fitted white dress, moving slowly through the frame. That was Willow. Right after, 2 police officers appeared from the right, one blocking her, the other circling behind. Malcolm froze the video exactly at the moment the hem of the skirt was pulled up. No words, no effects. Just a blunt, cold act, sharp as a knife slicing through silence. Zuri gripped the edge of the table. It was not anger. Everything was clearer than any spoken testimony. Sweat slid down her neck. Veins bulged at her temple, and the old bruise on her wrist from that disciplinary hearing throbbed, as all the missing details snapped into place. "Can you copy it to another device?" she asked, her voice rough. "Not just that," Malcolm replied, pulling out an encrypted hard drive. "I can reconstruct the entire data path from camera to when Heller's access blocked it. There are traces of a temporary deletion, but the server kept a buffer. That proves not only the existence of data, but also intent to interfere." Zuri finally exhaled, for the first time that day, feeling the air lighten inside her chest. "You still have other copies, right?" "I sent one to Sasha's encrypted email. Another's on a backup drive at home, and this one," he said, raising the small USB. "If you want to release it yourself." Zuri took it, squeezing as if she were holding a lifeline to pull someone back from the edge. In a world where real screams were mocked as performance, this video was living proof. No one could say nothing's confirmed anymore. No frame left to distort the truth. Every angle, every footstep, every bit of wind through the trees as the skirt was lifted, all was recorded. "Thank you," Zuri said, voice low, almost like a promise. Malcolm shrugged. "I am not helping you. I am just fixing what never should have been erased." Willow's room was so quiet that the ticking wall clock sounded like a razor scraping across skin. She stood in front of the mirror, the old one with the dark wood frame her mother left behind, now reflecting a different person. The girl in the mirror no longer had the evasive eyes from the day at the supermarket, shuffled her feet for fear of being pointed at. Her stance was straighter, her chest lifted just a bit higher, her hand steady as she placed it on the edge of the vanity. Willow gazed deep into her own eyes, then slowly picked up her phone and set it to record video. She did not need a script, did not need to think too long. What needed to be said had lodged in her throat since that day, just waiting for the right moment to be released. "My name is Willow Reese," she began, her voice not loud but clear, each word sharpened like metal. "I have been silent for many days because I thought if I spoke, they would say I made it up. I was afraid. Afraid someone would ask, 'Do you have proof?' Afraid there would be yet another headline questioning if I was a victim. But today, I am not afraid anymore." She paused for a few seconds, looking at the camera, eyes unblinking. "I am not silent to survive. I speak so I do not die every day." A few hours earlier, Sasha had sent a message. "I have a lawyer, not the kind who's famous on TV, but the kind who has never lost a civil rights case in real life." The lawyer's name was Renata Miles, known for lawsuits against public agencies and police departments accused of covering up misconduct. Renata did not seek sympathy. She sought evidence, reopened files, and pressed on every gap in the structures of power accustomed to being untouchable. Sasha described her first call with Renata. "We do not need their pity," Renata said coldly. We need a lawsuit, a precedent-setting verdict, a legal blade aimed right at the people behind the uniform who think they are immune to consequences. Zuri listened and replied simply, "Let's begin." That afternoon, the three of them sat in an old cafe near the church. Renata arrived on time, a file already in hand, no small talk. She opened it, pointing to a red-marked section, the personnel file of the large officer who had pinned Willow, showing he had once been involved in an internal complaint but was not disciplined. Reason: lack of evidence. "Now we have it," Renata said, her voice rough as ash. "And this time, it will be shown in the one place that will keep them up at night for the rest of their lives." Willow sat beside her, hand on her knee, for the first time not clenched tight. She no longer felt surrounded. Each person at that table had chosen where to stand. They did not represent a movement, a slogan, or a hashtag. They represented a truth that had survived distortion and pain denied. Renata closed the file, looking Willow straight in the eye. "They will threaten, smear, even try to force you to take back everything you have said. But if you are ready, we will turn the silence of hundreds before you into weight. You are not alone." Willow did not need more time to decide. "I have never been alone," she said. "I just never had the chance to speak with my name." That night, not a single mainstream news channel mentioned Willow or Zuri, but 4 independent networks simultaneously broadcast a video less than 1 minute long. No commentary, no editing, no soundtrack, only raw, unfiltered images, exposing an act that everyone had heard of, but few had seen at the very moment it happened. The screen showed a sunlit parking lot, white shoes, a hand reaching into private space, and a muffled scream behind a blanched face. Zuri's kick seemed to split the air, knocking the man backward, blood spurting in silence, yet touching every viewer's veins, waiting for outrage. Within less than 2 hours, from a southern neighborhood in town, a group of students raised a cardboard sign, black paint scrawled across, "Her skirt is not your playground." The sign moved from one set of hands to another, from street corners to social media, from silent windows to the square in front of police headquarters. As the night deepened, the crowd grew. No one chanted slogans, no one blew whistles or banged pots, just the heavy tread of feet, and a silence dense as a fist tightening around the criminal's neck. Zuri and Willow watched from the second floor of a rented apartment, looking down at the square. Below, flashlights, phones, and the glare of television stations illuminated every upturned face. A young woman in a scarf, book held high to echo Willow's stance in the video. An older man in a worn military uniform, shoulders stooped but still upright. A girl about 10 years old was beside her mother, sketching a dress with a red X. The diversity did not come from a campaign. It arose from a long, smoldering anger that had finally found its true name. Willow gripped Zuri's wrist, disbelief in her eyes. "All these people? Just because of a video?" Zuri shook her head gently. "Not just because of the video, because it spoke for things they had lived through, but no one had ever believed." Inside the building, the duty officers were as taut as stretched wire. A young officer kept checking the door, while the old deputy chief turned his back to the security monitors, both hands clamped around his chair. Everyone knew that silence was scarier than protest, because it was not aimed at a single person, it was aimed at the entire system. Online, Willow's article, "If He Wears a Badge, Does It Make Him God?" spread to over 500,000 shares. In the piece, she did not detail what happened, but described her feelings after returning home, sitting alone in a silent room. "I thought I would scream, but in fact, I sat there like a stone that knows it is being stepped on, but is told to be grateful it was not crushed." Zuri read the article quietly. She did not share or comment. She simply stood, feeling the movement from one person to a whole community. Not the kind of fighting for justice, but a reminder that every skirt, every raised arm, every silenced word would eventually be restored to its proper place in the truth. And once the truth is revealed, neither titles, ranks, nor threats will remain a shield. That night, the wind blew harder, but the flag outside the headquarters no longer waved at the wind's command. It hung still, as if it knew the wind had come to listen to people talk about justice. The words, "We apologize," appeared no fewer than 5 times on the front page of the newspaper that once twisted headlines about Willow, this time in smaller, more discreet font, as if they understood an apology was the last step, never enough to erase the stain once branded on the honor of a woman violated in daylight. The morning news no longer called Zuri an officer out of line, instead shifting to police intervening in misconduct, but the tone had lost its old confidence, replaced by the caution typical of those who realize they have stood on the wrong side. No one apologized for being silent for too long. They only scrambled to avoid blame, but even that was enough for the town to reconsider what they once mocked, once ignored, once dismissed as a minor affair. Willow sat quietly by the small window, running her hand over a folded letter. The childish scrawl stood out, each stroke sharp as a knife. "I'll be brave like you, even if my hands shake." There was no return address, no punctuation, only a signature and blue marker, and a drawing of a dress with a red line slashed through it. Willow read it over and over, as if each word had not been written for her, but for her 12-year-old self, the girl forced to bow her head in the schoolyard because of a rumor, the one who stood in the hallway listening to an old supervisor's voice. "Wearing a skirt like that, you can't claim you didn't ask for it." Zuri entered, holding a handwritten list. At the top, a bold note, "Those who reported but were silenced." She sat beside Willow, her eyes calm but far from cold. "I do not know who that girl is, but I know this," Zuri said, placing a hand on the letter. "Sometimes justice does not live in the court. It lives in a handwritten line, sent without expecting a reply." Together they looked down at the square through the second-floor window. Below, people carried wooden boards, banners, printed images, quotations, even lines of unrhymed but bloody poetry. An old woman with shaking hands still held up a picture of Willow dropping her books, and a group of students sketched Zuri mid-kick. No one led, no one waved any party flag. Only those once ignored stepped out of the shadows to stand together in the same light. Willow nodded, short and firm. They were no longer victims. They were living memory, impossible to bury. Every step they took was a slap at the machine that had raised monsters, and that letter from the 10-year-old girl was the clearest proof. Justice is not something handed down but a choice, even when hands tremble, lips dry, eyes blurred. They had chosen not to be silent, and the town had no path back. The internal hearing took place in a stifling room lit by yellow lights. The walls were paneled in dark wood. Above them, the silver star emblem of the police department, casting a cold gaze down on the row of seats opposite. The 2 accused officers sat side by side, leaning back as if forced to attend a dull meeting rather than confront the truth. The larger officer's face was expressionless, arms folded, eyes darting toward the attorney preparing to speak. The elderly lawyer, hair salt and pepper and closely cropped, stood up gently, stepping into the center of the room, hands neatly arranging his files, before lifting his head. His voice was steady, not a tremor in it. "My client denies all allegations. What happened was an unfortunate misunderstanding in a tense situation that neither side wished to escalate further." The sound of a pen scratching paper came from the review board, but in that room, no one responded. Only one person moved slowly to the witness stand. It was Willow Reese, holding a large black and white printout, the light from the projector behind her throwing her silhouette onto the wall like a silent witness raising a hand to point. She did not look at the 2 officers, nor at the board. She looked directly into the recording lens set up in front, as if the real judges were all those out there, not inside these walls. Willow drew a long breath, her voice not loud but tight and clear. "This is not a misunderstanding. This is a deliberate act. This is organized humiliation. And this is a crime that does not need a gun or spilled blood to inflict harm." She handed the print to the board, then set it firmly on the stand. The image was pulled from the original video, the moment the officer's wrinkled hand reached into the skirt, his half-shut eyes full of delight. and behind him, the large officer's face as he held her shoulders tightly. One well-timed frame had exposed the entire nature of the act. Willow stepped back, her eyes unwavering. "If you call this a misunderstanding, then from now on, every hand that reaches into a woman's body will be called professional reflex. Every force touch will be excused as job stress, and every child who grows up will learn that justice wears a uniform, not action." She paused, letting each word land with its weight. Below, the officers still did not react, but the lawyer's hand began to clench the file. A board member reached to adjust the microphone, flipping quickly through the notes in front of him. None of them met Willow's eyes. They looked at their papers, at the camera, at each other, anywhere else, because there was something in her voice that could not be justified by regulations, and no one interrupted her, because to interrupt would mean admitting they had heard everything. Willow nodded and stepped down. No one applauded, but silence was no longer evasion. It was the sound of a blade striking the thick shell the system had worn for too long. One layer had cracked, and she did not leave the room as a victim pleading for pity. She left as the first to stand still in a room of feigned deafness and declare, "I am still alive, and for that reason, you are not allowed to be silent." Zuri Hale stood tall in the council room, the old file open to page 7 in her hands. Every black-inked line seemed to challenge those seated behind the long table. She glanced across the room, showing neither fear nor room for compromise. At the back, media cameras pointed at her like silent threats, but she refused to let them steer the story. Her voice rang out, clear and unshaken, no microphone needed. "I just finished reading Regulation Number 43, Chapter 3, about civilian contact," she said, tapping the file. "Nowhere does it allow a police officer under any circumstance to touch a woman's body without formal safety grounds." Raising the file, eyes locked on the counsel, she asked, "So, when is an officer allowed to lift a girl's skirt?" The question landed, heavy and undeniable. No one answered. The silence was deep, the kind that exposes what the law once tried to hide. A council member moved to adjust his glasses, then froze, afraid to break the quiet. The only sound was the click of cameras recording the moment. That silence was no longer a choice. It was evidence, proof the system had seen, known, and chosen to look away. Willow sat in the second row, hands in her lap, eyes never leaving Zuri. That childhood friend now stood as steady as a pillar, not angry or loud, but asking a question that needed no embellishment. In the back, reporters whispered and flipped through notes, but all knew this question could not be dodged. Those present would have to live with having heard it, and having chosen silence. Zuri closed the file with a sharp thud. "If no one answers, this will go in the minutes." She walked toward Willow, who nodded quietly. No one stopped her, because once the truth is asked in public, even without an answer, it cannot be erased. On the morning after the hearing, an anonymous email was sent to the entire internal list of the city police department. The subject line was just one sentence: "We have been silent for too long." Attached was a short audio clip, a man's voice low and rough, breathing fast, but every word carefully chosen, as if he were prying chains from his neck. He witnessed something similar 2 years ago. A girl was detained in the parking lot behind headquarters. "I wanted to speak out, but the one who got transferred was the only person who did. She was not Zuri. But what happened to her was the same, and now Zuri is being punished for doing what all of us should have done." The recording quickly spread, not through official news, but through private chat groups. Whispered calls during breaks, quiet glances exchanged in the station's hallways. No one knew the sender's name, the voice was unclear, but the truth was sharper than ever. Zuri was not an isolated case. She was merely the first surface that society had seen, but beneath it was a dense network of wounds that had never healed. By mid-afternoon, an official notice was posted on the operations room door. Lieutenant Mark Heller was suspended from duty pending investigation for tampering with and destroying internal evidence. The news traveled slowly, but landed like a punch to the backbone of a machine that always believed itself untouchable. No one dared to laugh, no one dared to clap, only eyes cast down, avoiding and ashamed. The 2 officers directly involved in the assault were placed in the local jail as criminal suspects. Prosecution was underway by the district attorney's office, and what was first called a misunderstanding during duty was now properly labeled in official files: sexual assault, abuse of power, and intimidation of a justice official. The town that once applauded late-night patrols now faced the risk of being questioned for every time it ignored a cry for help. Willow read the news in silence, hands clutching the edge of a newspaper someone had slipped under her apartment door. She did not cry. She did not smile. She only brushed her hand over the name Zuri Hale, now printed in the same headline as the phrase "brave officer." That same local paper had once twisted her story, smeared her character, and questioned her motives for standing up. Now they had to rewrite every word, every period, in the honor they thought they had lost. Zuri had no time to read. She was sitting in a small room where the Independent Investigation Unit was temporarily headquartered. A female investigator had just asked the first question: "Are you prepared to provide all the internal documents you have stored?" Zuri nodded, placing a hard drive and a thick handwritten notebook on the table. "This is not about revenge. This is about the people we never dared look in the eye. Now we have to look." That was when the story officially entered a new stage. It was no longer just the truth between 2 friends. It was the truth of a town that had covered its eyes, now forced to confront itself. Willow walked across the marble steps, once echoing with the judgment of others. There was no crowd or cameras now, only sunlight and a gentle breeze. In the small square she paused as strangers watched, each look making her steps lighter. A young boy held a sign, "Our skirts, our dignity," while a serious little girl stood nearby. Willow did not cry. Her faint smile came from knowing that at last the unspeakable had been heard. Zuri waited on the corner, uniform stained and shoulder pad crooked from a recent struggle. When Willow approached and touched her arm, Zuri gripped her hand, her eyes shining. For the first time, a skirt made the whole system tremble. She admitted softly, no longer hiding behind toughness. Willow nodded, her fear gone. The skirt was never the reason they made it one. Her words were steady, meant as much for herself as for Zuri. Around them, people kept a respectful distance. An older woman handed Willow a bouquet of pale lavender, thanking her for speaking up for those who could not. Zuri stood quietly, hands in her pockets, the tension in her posture easing. She realized the worst thing is not violence itself, but when it happens before everyone and no one cares. Yet today, a skirt, a video, and a single voice had forced the city to pay attention. A group of students passed by, one girl pinning a badge on Willow's shirt. "Justice is when you know you are not wrong and someone stands beside you." Willow turned to Zuri and asked, "Is there more we have to do?" Zuri replied, "We have to call out everyone who saw and stayed silent." Willow nodded firmly. Their joined hands said everything. What once made them outsiders now made them unbreakable. 1 week after the footage was released and the crowds outside the police headquarters began to thin, an official notice was posted on the main gate. Independent inspectors. No entry without authorization. The citizens who once held up signs now quietly stepped back, watching from a distance. A dark black SUV without insignia pulled up to the front, and 4 people in plain clothes stepped out, each carrying a small briefcase, none speaking except for a short nod to the guard on duty. They were investigators from the State Administrative Oversight Committee, sent to audit the entire camera system, under an order signed by the State Inspector General after mounting evidence pointed to data tampering. Zuri was not allowed near the scene, but stood on the 3rd floor of the neighboring building, watching each step of the investigation team through a sliding window. Next to her was Malcolm, the one who helped recover the video. He crossed his arms, sleeves rolled high, his gaze not hiding a sense of satisfaction. That system was designed to stop criminals, but when those running it become the criminals, everything reverses, he said quietly, his voice steady and weighty. Down in the lot, one of the investigators turned to the head of internal security and presented a warrant. "I need full access, including all backup versions on off-site servers." The man accepted the order, his eyes darting to a nearby camera before bowing his head and leading them inside. In the tech room, Pale blue light from the screens shone on tense faces. A female investigator opened a folder. We found at least 3 log files altered, timestamps matching the incident in the lot behind the administrative building. Most notable, all actions were authenticated by the same managerial logging code. The state's largest newspaper immediately published the initial findings. System supervisors suspected of evidence tampering. That same day, a brief press conference was held, no frills. Before the cameras and dozens of reporters, the chief investigator, a middle-aged man with a deep voice and expressionless face, looked straight into the lens and said clearly, "This is the first time in state history that the head of a security system has been investigated for hiding evidence in a harassment case with racial elements." No one added anything after that, because every truth had now become a suspended verdict over those who once believed they controlled the shadow. Willow watched the press conference from a laptop on a wooden desk in the city library, where she had once turned the pages of a book on that fateful afternoon. Her hand lightly traced the screen. Then she turned to look at a high school student quietly taking notes beside her. A glance met hers, not because she was famous, but because someone recognized her as the girl from the video that shook the entire country. But Willow did not retreat. She smiled softly, then returned to the report she was writing for the next hearing. At the same time, Zuri was asked to cooperate as a key witness and was temporarily kept in her position but supervised by a provisional board. As she left the temporary office, she met a young officer who bowed to her, hands pressed over his heart. No words needed. It was just a way people learn to show respect when witnessing someone choose what is right, even at the cost of their career and political survival. Willow chose a second-floor classroom at a girls' high school to host her first workshop, tacking up a whiteboard and writing in red marker, naming it in silence. She did not rally or advertise, just sent handwritten letters to each student who had messaged her after the incident. On the day of the workshop, nearly 60 plastic chairs were arranged, all filled within 15 minutes. The girls, some in uniform, others in oversized hoodies, all sat quietly, gripping pens, eyes fixed on the woman above, the one who made the system answer for a single skirt being lifted. Willow did not start with a speech. She held up a photo, a still from the video, her legs exposed, eyes shut, with Zuri's shadow behind her. "They say I am acting, but this is a frame with no director," she said, her voice low, every word pinned down like a steel tack. No applause followed, only the sighs of children who had never dared to speak. A curly-haired student stood up, hands trembling, and whispered, "Once I was held after class because the teacher said I laughed too much." Willow stepped down, not touching the girl's shoulder, but laying a stack of blank paper on the desk. "Write it down, not to accuse, but to name what they force us to get used to." During that time, Zuri was summoned to the director's office to hear a promotion decision. She was nominated as deputy head of the area control unit, a position with a private office, her car, and a higher salary bracket. The messenger was the deputy chief himself, voice measured. "Your actions were controversial, but you proved your mettle." Zuri looked him in the eye, and a silence fell like a broken chord in a song. She replied slowly, "I do not need a promotion. I need to be back on the street where these lifts start." She left without signing any papers, leaving behind the wavering gaze of those used to using promotion as a gag. In the hallway, a young staffer pressed the elevator, sneaking a glance at Zuri before whispering, "Thank you for not leaving." She nodded. No need for a loud voice when presence alone is enough to shake things up. That afternoon, Zuri returned to her old patrol route, stepping out of the cruiser just as she had before. Wind swept through the administrative district, where the parking lot that had been the scene now bore a new sign, "Area monitored by independent authority." She glanced at it and moved on, her hand resting lightly on the baton at her hip as a reminder. In the distance, a group of teenagers was debating an online scenario. Zuri walked up, using neither her title nor showing off her rank, just asking, "If the one whose skirt was lifted was your sister, what would you do?" The group fell silent. One boy pressed his lips and said, "I guess we would shout." She nodded. then you are already different from many adults. That evening, Willow posted a photo, not of herself or the incident, but the classroom board, marked in a student's messy handwriting, "Silence is compromise." Her caption read, "Justice does not need a high podium. It just needs to start at the right moment." The sentence was shared thousands of times, not for drama, but because it came from someone who once stood silent, now able to put it into words. The statewide Integrity Badge ceremony took place in a small community center hall, with no grand stage and no LED screens flashing anyone's name. Under warm yellow lights, Zuri Hale stood among hundreds of people, young and old, all backgrounds, people who knew her not for any title, but for the kick she delivered when justice was left for dead. The inspector stepped forward, his hand trembling slightly as he pinned the badge to her uniform. "For standing up when everyone else turned away," he said. The words were simple, but the applause that followed shook the ceiling. Zuri did not read from a speech. She took the mic and spoke softly, as if to each person alone. "I once thought silence was safety, but one day silence became the excuse for someone to reach for the person I cared for most. That day I learned integrity is not in this badge," she said, touching her chest, "but in our hands, if we choose to keep them steady." In the front row, Willow sat with her hair neatly tied, eyes sad, but steadfast. When Zuri stepped down, they held hands, saying nothing, but every gaze understood. This was not about one person, but a decision to refuse endurance. After the ceremony, the media hounded Willow. Publishers, fashion brands, everyone wanting to make her a feminist icon, buy her story, print her face on shirts, mugs, even perfume. Willow read them all, tore up the contracts and letters, and mailed them back. When a reporter asked why she refused the chance to change her life, Willow said, "I don't need a life redrawn by those who profit from my silence. This isn't a brand, it's the pain of survival." She chose to teach part-time at the high school, where her friendship was once called deviant. Every afternoon, she and Zuri walked from the school gate to the lot, a path once leading to the darkest moment, now lined with 6 new cameras and a notice of student rights. Once a student asked, "Miss Willow, if it happened again, what would you do?" She paused, then answered, "I'd shout louder, but I'd also turn back and hold my hand." Zuri still refused any promotion. She worked her shifts, but often attended community events, listening more than speaking, sometimes joining Willow to host open talks about hidden harassment. Asked why she stayed in a system that betrayed her, Zuri replied, "People like me have to stay, so others can't keep getting away with it." Outside the center where she received the badge, someone chalked on the wall, "Trust is not rebuilt with symbols. It's rebuilt by those who do not turn away." The words were never erased, and for a month, the plaza outside the center was called Square of Those Who Do Not Turn Away. At the high school where everything began, where laughter and looks once shamed 2 girls who dared hold hands across race, there now stood a white brick memorial wall. No faces, no names engraved, just one black steel sentence, "If you see wrong, do not turn away." Not complex, not grand, but words that cut through every excuse, every bowed head that allowed evil to grow in daylight. Willow proposed the wall, not to honor herself or anyone else, but so children would know that sometimes silence is not a choice, but surrender. On Inauguration Day, she made no speech. She touched the words, bowed to them as if apologizing to her younger self, then turned to take Zuri's hand. Elsewhere on campus, Zuri spoke to a group of new police graduates, dressed in civilian clothes, a windbreaker reading "Community Advisor" across her shoulders. One rookie asked, "Is being a cop about catching bad guys?" Zuri looked straight at him, her eyes not cold but piercing. "No, being a cop isn't about arrests. It's about stopping bad people from becoming legal," she replied, each word ringing out. No one laughed or asked more. They understood it was not a slogan, but a lesson paid in tears and erased footage. After the incident, Zuri visited each new class, unpaid, not required, sitting to share the story. steady and blunt. No painting things better or worse, just telling what happened, from the officer's stare to the kick that forced him to see the line. She told them not to frighten them, but to remind them. The power they wear is given by the people, not to shield anyone's darkest instincts, no matter the badge. Willow sometimes joined Zuri at those meetings, quiet in the last row, notebook in hand. Once, a female rookie asked, "Do you ever forgive them?" Willow thought for a long time, then answered, "I forgive myself for standing still. As for them, let the law do its work." Where they were once called deviant friends, people now spoke of them as the heartbeats that reset the city's sense of justice. Not because they were braver than others, but because they held each other up when most would bow. Sometimes that's enough to change a city, or at least make anyone thinking of crossing the line stop and reconsider. A small therapy room sat quietly at the end of a gray and white hallway. The scent of wood and paper lingering like time itself had slowed within these walls. Willow entered and sat on an old chair, hands on her knees, eyes fixed on her shoes, not lost in thought, but silenced by the tightness in her throat each time she tried to speak. She feared anyone's gaze might find what she was desperately hiding. The therapist said nothing, only sitting across with a cup of tea, tilting her head in quiet encouragement. Willow remained still, surviving as she once had when her skirt was lifted in broad daylight. When the session ended, she whispered a soft thank you and left with measured steps, as if each movement needed careful planning. Outside, Zuri waited without questions or demands. Instead, she gently touched Willow's shoulder and pointed toward the southern park, the place they once escaped to read, and where they were once mocked as the white one and the black one. What a sick pair. Willow sat on a worn wooden bench, placing her hand where the word freak had been carved, now faint beneath paint. Zuri sat beside her, eyes on the sky, asking about the first book they had argued over. Willow smiled, recalling their debate. The heroine should leave, but her friend insisted she stay and fight. If everyone walks away, evil wins. Zuri shrugged. Willow nodded, finally meeting her gaze. The ones who walk away from Omelas. Now I understand. Walking away isn't always cowardice. Sometimes staying is the cruelest choice. The wind stirred dry leaves as they sat in silence, not numb anymore, but like a deep breath after a storm, a clock ticking anew. Willow leaned on Zuri's shoulder, allowing herself to rest without shame for the first time. Zuri whispered, "Back then, we had no words for what happened. Now we do, and we don't need anyone else's validation." Willow closed her eyes, sighing, "And if someone needs to hear it, I'll tell them. They won't have to guess in fear." A little girl in a blue plaid shirt stood shyly nearby. As they passed, she asked softly for a picture. Zuri smiled, and Willow gently touched her shoulder. As the camera rose, the girl whispered, "My dad says you're why I believe in what's right. He was a soldier and knew the cost of silence." Willow squeezed her hand silently. In the fiery dusk of a town shaken by outrage, this quiet moment spoke louder than any slogan. Courage need not shout to reach hearts. After the photo, the girl ran to her father, a tall man in a faded uniform who saluted Zuri before walking away silently, leaving behind a rare, deeply felt peace. Willow hugged her worn copy of Jane Eyre, its pages marked but etched into her heart. This time she held it not as a shield, but as a symbol of survival, whole and unbowed. She glanced at Zuri, whose uniform seemed lighter, no longer armor but skin, tied to ideals and resistance. "I don't think I've ever seen this park so beautiful," Willow whispered. Zuri nodded silently as they walked on, feet crunching over bricks by white daisies. No one tugged Willow's skirt anymore. No one dared. Perhaps not because of the video or hashtags, but because she walked openly now, head high, steady steps, book hugged tight. Near the park's edge, a boy ran up, offering a purple wildflower. "My mom told me to give this to the brave person," he said. Eyes misting, Willow accepted. Zuri smiled. "No TV, no awards. These kids get it better than any adults we've faced." Willow smiled, whispering for the first time, "I'm not scared of anyone pulling my skirt anymore. Not because they won't try, but because if they do, I won't stand still." The words were a quiet declaration, light enough to float on the breeze, strong enough to burn into memory. Together, they walked on, as if the fight never ended, but this time, they chose chose the path, the rules, and how to walk without ever letting anyone pull them back. 1 year after the video exposed the truth, the town that once tried to bury everything began to crack. The original investigation, long hidden, was forced to go statewide as more witnesses came forward. Within 8 months, 5 senior officers, including those in charge of security and personnel, resigned under public pressure. Organizational culture was stripped bare, and for the first time, an internal harassment case was prosecuted openly and criminally. During that year, skirt justice became a constant presence on social media, spreading from a law students' forum into classrooms, protests, and daily life. People once dismissed for lack of evidence became witnesses for a new movement, and the hashtag turned into a symbol for a hard question: who polices those with badges? Willow and Zuri did not hide. They spoke at international conferences, sharing not as victims and witnesses, but as women who took back their voices from the system. Zuri explained the cover-ups, and Willow spoke about the fear of being silenced. The room rose when Willow ended. "We did not ask for justice, we brought it down where it was hidden." The next day, under a photo of them holding hands, the headline read, "A skirt was pulled up, but someone pulled justice down." It all began on an ordinary afternoon when Willow, in a white dress, left the library. She became the target of abuse by 2 officers, and even more by the silence of bystanders. But Zuri, her childhood friend, did not look away. One kick, a voice of defiance, and the truth could no longer be hidden. Instead of fading, the fight grew. Evidence surfaced, protection networks broke, and for the first time, justice emerged not from a courtroom, but from collective refusal to be silent. A year later, trust was rebuilt not by authority, but by 2 women who stood together. Willow helped other girls, Zuri stayed on the street to protect, and the white dress that once marked humiliation became a symbol. Their story taught the town that justice is not given from above, but reclaimed by those who dare to stand up. Sometimes one act of courage is enough to make everyone else turn and face what is wrong. If you have made it to this last line, perhaps your heart has clenched more than once, out of outrage, out of compassion, and out of faith that justice truly has a form. The story of Willow and Zuri is not a legend spun from illusion. It is a mirror reflecting a reality we once turned away from. The voice of those who were never heard. The embrace between 2 friends who grew up together in a world rigidly divided between us and them. But from that very line, they proved that humanity is stronger than any uniform, and that a lifted skirt can also lift a mask off an entire system. Do not forget what you have just read. Out there, someone else may be gripping the strap of their bag, waiting for a single person to stand up, even if all it takes is a glance. And if that day comes, I hope you will remember Zuri's words. Justice does not come on its own. It arrives when we dare to call out what is wrong and step forward when others turn away. You can share this story, send it to a friend, or simply keep it within yourself as a quiet promise to stand on the side of what is right, even if your legs are still trembling.